All right. Yeah. So, hello, everyone. Thank you all so much for being here. My name is Regan. As Matthew mentioned, I'm a naturalist at the DuPont Nature Center. Before I was a naturalist, I was a student at Colgate University in New York studying environmental biology. So, that's kind of what my background is. Not necessarily paleontology or geology, even though I'm really interested in those things. So, if I say anything that feels a little maybe different than what you know, please feel free to correct me. Background is in biology. This is just something that I'm super interested in. Um, just want to start with a little bit of background on the Nature Center. So if you haven't been before, we're in Milford, Delaware, out by Slaughter Beach, that little red point on the map. We're right on the Delaware Bay, which is the view that you're seeing in the bottom picture. We're actually on the Mispillion Harbor Reserve, and so the Mispillion Harbor is where the Mispillion River meets Cedar Creek in the Delaware Bay. So we have this really pretty location, but it's also a really environmentally important location. And so a lot of our programming at the Nature Center focuses on the Delaware Bay, the environment, local history, all sorts of things. But if there's two things that people really come to the Nature Center to talk about, it's horseshoe crabs and it's shorebirds. And not to pick a favorite child, but unfortunately, horseshoe crabs of those two definitely are my favorite thing to talk about, which is part of the reason we have this program today. And so the title is Living Fossils or Modern Wonders Evolution of the Horseshoe Crab. And so we're tackling a couple of things here. First, of course, the evolutionary history of the horseshoe crab, but we're also going to talk about this concept of a living fossil, and we're also going to think about horseshoe crabs as something more modern. And so I want to start with this question of has anything changed? And so on the left, we have this picture of a fossilized horseshoe crab, and on the right, we have a picture of a horseshoe crab that could have been taken yesterday. And it's really easy to look at these things and think, oh, well, those are the exact same thing. Nothing has changed. And so time and time again, people, including myself, always come back to this question of what was the horseshoe crab's past like? How did we get here? Has anything changed? What has changed? And so I'll give you a hint. The answer to this question is yes, but we're going to look into what changes have happened and when they've happened. But first, we need to understand how we can study this evolution. And so a lot of evolutionary studies are going to compare morphology, which is how things look, or they can compare DNA. But for our ancient things and our fossils, that DNA is degraded and we don't have access to that genetic component of these studies anymore. So we really have to rely on how they look, and that's going to be with fossils. And so, since you're the Fossil Club, I'm sure you're pretty familiar with the fossilization process, but I'll just briefly note that fossilization is really not that common for horseshoe crabs. And so, their exoskeleton is made out of chitin, which is really strong, but it's nice and sturdy for our horseshoe crab, but it's still a little bit flexible, and so it doesn't fossilize all that well. Most of the soft parts of our horseshoe crab or any animal, any soft-bodied animals are going to decompose, but there have been some really lucky exceptions with our horseshoe crabs, just in fossilization generally, that have allowed us to kind of better understand their evolutionary history. And so that's the story that we're going to dive into. And first, we need to go really far back in time. Looks like we might have gone a little too far back in time. So we're actually going to jump forward just a little bit. We're going to stop here, which is in the Cambrian period, which lasted from 541 to 485 million years ago. So when we're talking about geologic time, it can get a little bit confusing. And so I found this graphic, and this is something that I really like that helps me to kind of visualize in my mind what kind of time scale we're thinking about. And so if you hold out an arm, starting at your shoulder is where we see the emergence of single-celled organisms, and going all the way down your arm, it's not until we hit your palm that we're actually seeing the Cambrian period, which is 541 million years ago, which is where we're starting. And so that little slideshow skip I did is actually skipping a huge amount of time, even though this is 541 million years ago. It's so long ago. It's really just in the palm of your hand. We're going to work through our hand now in this presentation, starting with that Cambrian period. And so got a visualization in the bottom right corner of what we think the Earth might have looked like at this time. We see a lot of our continents are kind of south oriented, which is really different from our Earth today. Now most of our land masses are in the northern hemisphere, so that's pretty interesting. At this time, the climate would have been pretty warm and tropical, and we had really high levels of carbon dioxide and leading to higher levels of oxygen. So one of the main consequences of this oxygenation is going to be the Cambrian explosion, which I'm sure you're all very familiar with. But it's this point in the fossil record where we see just a huge emergence and all of our major body plans begin to be represented. And so this is a pretty rapid event. And by rapid, we mean a couple of million years, of course, because what else would rapid mean? Um, And most of this diversity, well, actually, all of this diversity, well, no, most of this diversity is with our marine invertebrates. And so that's our animals without a backbone. At this time, our animals are getting defense mechanisms and what we call hard parts. And so they're gaining things that they're able to use to defend themselves, which is going to lead to predation because we're having predators now. And predation is going to drive a lot of changes within our ecosystem. One of our main groups of animals and those invertebrates that we see at this time are arthropods, including trilobites. And so our arthropods are going to be really important because our horseshoe crabs are arthropods. And we don't yet have horseshoe crabs, but we do have trilobites, which we'll talk about just a little bit. And so our trilobites are not actually an ancestor of a horseshoe crab, which was something that we maybe pondered, but they're just a relative of a horseshoe crab, but they have a pretty similar body plan. And so we know during the Cambrian period, that kind of horseshoe crab body plan-ish shape was introduced. A big difference between our trilobites and our horseshoe crabs is that our trilobites were really, really diverse and a lot more specialized. And so it's kind of hard to tell in these pictures, but in the top picture, those trilobites are pretty big. And in the bottom picture, our little fossil trilobite is just the size of a penny. And by specialized, we mean they're filling a lot of different ecological niches. So they're living in different habitats, they're eating different things. And this is something that our horseshoe crabs didn't do and still haven't done. And part of the reason we think the trilobites went extinct when the horseshoe crabs didn't is because horseshoe crabs have remained generalists while our trilobites were more specialized. We do happen to know quite a lot more about our trilobites, though, just because they have a stronger exoskeleton that's better for fossilization. And so, again, that horseshoe crab exoskeleton is made of chitin, whereas our trilobite exoskeleton is made out of calcite, which is a lot stronger of a material. It's going to fossilize better. And so, we knew a lot about trilobites, and we thought maybe this was the ancestor to the horseshoe crab. It's not, but it's still important to think about, kind of what was in our oceans during this period. So now we're going to move on to the Ordovician period, which lasted from 485 to 443 million years ago. This is going to be a really important period for our horseshoe crab. In terms of climate, of course, it kind of varied throughout the period because we're thinking about many, many millions of years. But overall, we saw a greenhouse climate, and this period ends with an ice age, which is going to be really important for all of our animals and plants on the planet at the time. At this point in time, we're still seeing diversity in the ocean, but we're not seeing any complex life on land. And we're also undergoing some pretty big earth changes. So things like tectonic plate movements, volcanoes are erupting, the sea levels are changing. And we also have an event going on, which is unfortunately not as easy to say as the Cambrian explosion, but it's the Great Ordovician Biodiversification Event. Does not roll off the tongue, but that's okay. It's still really, really important. So we're going to talk about it. This is just like the Cambrian explosion, but it's actually a whole lot bigger. And so this is the point in time where we actually think we saw the most significant increase in our Earth's biodiversity. So more than the Cambrian explosion. The big difference between the two is that the Cambrian explosion introduced all of these body plans, but the Great Ordovician Biodiversification Event introduced a lot of diversification on lower levels, lower taxonomic levels, so things like on the species and genus level, rather than that general kind of more, we're getting a circle animal, we're getting a square animal. We're now seeing like types of circle animals, types of square animals. Of course, this is an oversimplification, but it's a really good way to think about it. Again, we've got our Earth in the bottom right corner, but everyone wants to know, what are the horseshoe crabs doing? And so the Ordovician period is where we see our first true horseshoe crab, which is Lunataspis aurora. This is its fossil and an illustration of what we think it might have looked like. This one was found in Manitoba, Canada, in rocks that were dated to 445 million years ago. And so when people come into the Nature Center and say, how long have horseshoe crabs been around? We say 445 million years, and this is why. At this time, Canada would have been near the equator, so definitely in warmer waters. And this fossil we've placed in the order Xiphosaura, which is why we're calling it a true horseshoe crab. And so that's the order of horseshoe crabs that we still have today. Something that's really cool about this fossil is that we think it had fused segments. And so those segments we're talking about are in like the back part of the shell. And so that front domed, like circular part of the shell is called the prosoma. The back part is called the opistosoma, where we see all those segments. And we think those segments were all fused together. And so originally we thought all of kind of the early horseshoe crabs were like disjointed segments. I'll talk about it in a little bit, but this is something that we did not think our horseshoe crabs had. How can the illustrations are on the slide for Eugene's question? It's just the one in the. Are you able to see my slide?
So that
Okay.
maybe you may have to adjust the way that you're viewing the presentation. Make sure that you
Okay.
are showing speaker view and preferably in full screen.
Yeah, so it should be. It's just this one illustration in the corner here.
Yeah, Susan can see it. I
And
can
so
see
they
it
can
as
see it.
well. There's different ways to configure Zoom, and I think you, as the viewer, need to make sure that you have it on speaker view rather than like gallery or something. Sorry about that, Regan.
No, no worries. Okay. Hopefully that gets figured out. Um, and our horseshoe crabs at the time were really small, so only a few centimeters long, which is way, way smaller than our horseshoe crabs today. So I mentioned things about like fused segments, not fused segments, kind of weird. I also mentioned true horseshoe crabs, so we're throwing a lot of like weird stuff out here. So I want to take a second to just kind of clarify things that are kind of horseshoe crabs and things that are true horseshoe crabs. And so as I mentioned, anything in the order Xiphosaura are those true horseshoe crabs. At this time, we've also got some kind of horseshoe crabs. And so the first are the Synsophosarines, which are that picture in the top right corner. And so they look a lot like horseshoe crabs, but those segments in the opistosoma, that back segment, were not fully fused together. So these guys could actually roll up like a roly-poly or a pill bug, whereas our horseshoe crabs now just kind of like fold at their hinge. These guys could fully roll up. And so the Xiphosaurans could not roll up in that way. They could only fold at their hinge. We also have at this time Eurypterids, which are sea scorpions, and Chasmotaspidids, which are kind of difficult to describe with like a common name, but they're an arthropod kind of like our horseshoe crabs. We at one point in time thought that our Eurypterids and our Chasmotaspidids also might have been an ancestor to our horseshoe crab, but we've now decided that they're also just closely related. All right, so now we can move on to the Silurian period from 443 to 419 million years ago. Again, in the bottom right corner, we've got an illustration of what we think our Earth might have looked like. I've added some yellow stars here of where our horseshoe crabs might have been originating from. Unfortunately, we don't know for sure. All that's published about it is that they originated in the shallow seas over Europe. And so Europe's a pretty wide area. Shallow seas is kind of like a very vague definition. So we actually really just don't know for sure where our horseshoe crabs came from. This is kind of the best guess we have. During this period, the climate stabilized. And so, what we mean by that is that we're not seeing huge changes in temperature anymore, but it's just holding at a pretty warmer than the temperatures are today temperature. This caused glaciers to melt and, of course, our sea level to then rise. On land, we're starting to see plants appearing, which is really cool. But in our oceans, we have coral reefs appearing at this time, which is going to make our oceans more physically diverse. And also, fish or kind of fish like animals are going to gain jaws at this time. And so, now our horseshoe crabs might be gaining a new predator, and that's those jawfish. Of course, we have to talk about not just the Earth, but what our horseshoe crabs are doing. And so at this point in time, they're still small. In terms of their shape, we see a lot of segmentation, and their legs and a lot of the fossils we see actually extend past the prosoma. So again, that's that front part of their shell. And you can see in the fossils on the top, the legs actually gonna go past that prosoma, as well as in the illustration that's like a 3D reconstruction of a fossil. We see the legs are going past the prosoma. At this point in time, they're living in marine coastal waters, just like we see today. And the Synsophosarines, which are those guys that could roll up, are abundant still. And so our top fossils are Synsophosarines. The 3D reconstruction, we're not really sure how to classify it. And then the bottom right one we think is a Xiphosaurine, which again would be that true horseshoe crab. Now we can move on to the Devonian period from 419 to 359 million years ago. This period is known as the Age of Fishes. And so we saw some kind of fishies in the Silurian period, but this is really where we're getting kind of more true fish. On land, our plants are becoming more advanced, so we now have ferns and forests, and a lot of animals are also starting to move from the water to the land. On land, we see wingless insects, including scorpions, we see amphibians, unfortunately, this period is going to end with another mass extinction. I didn't mention before. Well, I kind of did. The Ordovician also ended with a mass extinction. Now we're seeing another one. It's not going to wipe out our horseshoe crabs, though. They're still small and their shape still varies, but we're still seeing a lot of segmentation. And you can see this picture is all like different segments of one fossil and an illustration. We're still seeing a lot of segments in that opistosoma. Their habitat, a lot of fossils from this time, we from like analyzing the rocks, we believe we're living in marine environments, but we actually are starting to see a transition of our horseshoe crabs to freshwater during this period. And so the fossil that I have here is Piquetia carteri. we believe to be found, or we believe was living in a marine environment. This one was actually found in Pennsylvania, so really close to home. Could have been like the great 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 grandfather of our Delaware Bay horseshoe crabs. And this one is in the order Xiphosaura, so it is a true horseshoe crab. Now we're moving on to the Carboniferous period, which is from 359 to 299 million years ago. And this is a really exciting time on Earth and for our horseshoe crabs. And so our climate is pretty tropical, but we're also seeing widespread coal swamps, which is how the Carboniferous period got its name because of all of that coal, all of that CO2, that carbon dioxide that's in the atmosphere. And what that carbon dioxide did is it helped trees to grow huge, which are then producing oxygen. And so this period had uniquely high oxygen levels. And so we think at this point in time, there's more oxygen on Earth than has ever been. One of the consequences of that oxygen is that we see reptiles, winged insects, and cockroaches that are all getting huge. And just like our animals on land are getting huge, our animals in the ocean are getting big too. And so our horseshoe crabs at this time, we actually see are starting to grow larger, and their shapes are still pretty diverse, as well as their habitats. Some are in freshwater, some are in swamps, some are in marine. So they're really starting to scatter all over the place. I mentioned before this was a really exciting period for our horseshoe crabs because this is the period where we see peak horseshoe crab diversity. So we think there were about 50 species of horseshoe crabs from this time compared to just 4 today. Unfortunately, at this time, our Synxophosaurines, little roly-poly horseshoe crabs, are in decline. But at this point in time, the Limulidae family is introduced, we think, and this is the family of horseshoe crabs that's still around to this day. So that's pretty cool. I've chosen two fossils to just kind of highlight here. One is from the genus Bellinurus, and one is from the genus Euproops, because those are two of the common genera we see from this time. I also want to talk about one fossil in particular that's really, really awesome. And so this is a fossilized Euproops danae. And what's cool about this is that its brain of this horseshoe crab is actually fossilized. And so I mentioned before, we don't usually see soft tissue, but the way in which this horseshoe crab died was fossilized, actually preserved. Well, not preserved, but it's where its brain was able to be preserved. So we have like a lighter color mineral where its brain was in A of that picture. That's what's like in the square. I also have my handy dandy plastic horseshoe crab model here to show you that this is kind of still what our horseshoe crab brain looks like. It's got kind of this like branching structure. Of course, this one is just plastic, but we see in the what we see in the fossil is still what we see in this and today. And so since 310 million years ago, our horseshoe crab brain has pretty much looked the same. This fossil is found in Mason Creek, Illinois, which is pretty cool. I've also added here an illustration of a modern horseshoe crab brain if you needed some more evidence. Also, in case you're curious why it looks like that, because that does not really look like a brain to us, it's got like that hole in the middle because that's where the esophagus of the horseshoe crab will go through, and then the branching structures have nerves that help connect to the eyes of the horseshoe crab. So we've got horseshoe crab brains in the Carboniferous period. Now, moving on to the Permian period from 299 to 252 million years ago. At this point in time, this is when we get Pangea, which I know a lot of people are big fans of. And one of the consequences of having this big land mass is that we have regional differences in climate. So, land that is now connected physically is going to be really different depending on where on the supercontinent you are. So, we're getting dry, deserty areas, and we're also getting latitudinal differences in climate. At this point in time, we're seeing plants with seeds like conifers, which we still see to this day. And unfortunately, we're seeing another extinction. It's known as the Permian Triassic or the end Permian mass extinction. And this is the largest recorded mass extinction in Earth's history. It's going to have really drastic changes to our climate and our ocean chemistry. What this is not going to change is the existence of our horseshoe crabs, which are still small. Their shape still varies, but a lot of our horseshoe crabs from this period, at least the fossils that we've found, actually resemble modern forms. And they're living both in freshwater and marine environments. And so, some little taxonomic specificities about what's happening here. We have the Australimulidae family, which is the fossil that's pictured on the left, and the Limulidae family, which are going to flourish. Unfortunately, the Paleolimulidae family, which is on the right, is going to end. Now, if you're just looking at these fossils, this probably doesn't really mean anything to you, but it's going to be really important when we're thinking about taxonomy of our horseshoe crabs today. Now we can move on to the Triassic period from 252 to 201 million years ago. Again, we see Pangea is kind of starting to break up. In terms of climate at this time, it's pretty tropical, and our reptiles are really dominating both on the land and in the water. This is where we're seeing our first dinosaurs and mammals appear, which is super cool. We're also seeing pterosaurs, which are flying vertebrates, are not actually dinosaurs, which I learned kind of recently, maybe a little bit embarrassingly. The pterosaurs are not actually dinosaurs. But this period is going to end in another mass extinction, which is where many marine reptiles are going to vanish, which may be good for our horseshoe crabs. They're kind of losing some of their predators, but that's the extinction that's really going to make room for dinosaurs. Our horseshoe crabs just cannot seem to get wiped out no matter what mass extinction comes their way. And at this point in time, they're starting to grow larger. And so, on average, they're between 10 and 20 inches, which is still small, but closer to the average size of horseshoe crabs that we see today. And their shapes at this time are very diverse. Something that we see in a lot of our fossils is overdeveloped or really just like long genal spines, which are the 2 points at the end of the prosoma. Those are known as the genal spines, which you can see in our fossil on the right. This is from Australolimulus fletcheri. It's got really, really long genal spines for some reason. This one actually would have been a freshwater dweller, which kind of scares me a bit because I don't think I would want to encounter this in like a lake when I'm trying to have like a nice little picnic day. But I think the ancient animals were doing all right. There's only one known specimen from this family, and it's this one. Something else really cool coming out of the Triassic period is this fossil, which we've named Vaterlimulus tricky. Does Vaterlimulus sound familiar to anybody? Maybe you can unmute or you can just leave me in suspense. That's okay. So it's named after Darth Vader because of the shape of the prosoma. The people who found and named this horseshoe crab thought it looked a lot like Darth Vader's helmet. This one is also a member of the Australolimullidae family and was found in Ohio and is only 4 inches long. So again, we still are seeing a lot of smaller horseshoe crabs. Now it's time to move on to the Jurassic period from 201 to 145 million years ago. Our tropical is still not our sorry, our climate is still pretty tropical. And also this is when we're seeing dinosaurs dominate, of course. We're also seeing our first birds appear, which were not quite birds, but something between like a reptile and the birds we see today. We've also got ichthyosaurs, giant crocodiles, sharks that look modern, and cephalopods. And so in our oceans, we've got some predators, some prey, and maybe some friends for our horseshoe crabs. So, of course, dinosaurs are really cool, but there's something that's way cooler coming out of the Jurassic period, and that's the Solnhofen limestone in Germany, which is a really famous, if you're into that kind of thing, um, limestone. And the type of the limestone it is a really good building material. So it's been heavily quarried throughout the years. And that's how we've stumbled upon a lot of fossils that were buried in this limestone. Once upon a time, this area was at the edge of a sea, had really high salt content, and was oxygen poor. And so a lot of animals that were going here and dying were not getting eaten by scavengers, and so it helped them to fossilize really well. And so from these limestones, we've got tons of diverse and well-preserved fossils, even things that we don't usually see fossilized, like jellyfish and octopus and plants, and then of course horseshoe crabs. And so all of these horseshoe crab fossils in this picture are from the Solnhofen limestone, except the one in the bottom left corner, still from a different place in Germany. In addition to just having a lot of cool fossils, our horseshoe crabs in this period are getting a little bit bigger, and their shape is really similar to our modern horseshoe crabs, and they're starting to return to this mostly marine habitat. One of the famous genera or genuses, well, it's genera. One of the famous genus from this period is Mesolemulus. This is usually the fossil that we see compared to modern horseshoe crabs. And so when I started this program with that picture of a fossil, that was a member of Mesolemulus. This one I've chosen to put on here is really cool because we can actually see like the leg structure of our horseshoe crab really well. And if you have seen a horseshoe crab, this is basically what their legs look like. So we know during the Jurassic period, our horseshoe crabs are really, really starting to look like our horseshoe crabs that we see today. Also, something, of course, from the Solnhofen limestone, we've got some trackways, which are like the last kind of like little footprints of our horseshoe crab were fossilized. Again, this is from Mesolemulus, but it's really cool to see that our horseshoe crabs were kind of walking in the way we see them walking today. And the shape of these trackways also looks a lot like, well, we can tell from the shape of the trackways that our horseshoe crabs had back legs, which are called pusher legs, similar to our horseshoe crabs today. And so there's basically tons of evidence that are like, yep, our horseshoe crabs are staying the same from this point. But we have more time to go through. We're now in the Cretaceous period from 145 to 66 million years ago. We're still seeing a tropical climate, would have been really warm. Our question is, do we know what the second set of tracks came from? I'm not sure actually. That is a really good question. I wish I could answer that. I only know of the ones from the horseshoe crab. And so our climate is tropical, and we don't really have any below freezing temperatures, and our poles are also pretty warm. We don't have a lot of ice there. Our supercontinent is really starting to break up. It's becoming a little bit more familiar to what we would expect it to look. On land, we've got flowering plants, and this period ends in another mass extinction, which is the one that is the end of the dinosaurs, the pterosaurs, and a ton of marine invertebrates. But there's one marine invertebrate. I don't know if you've heard of it. It's called the horseshoe crab, does not fall victim to this mass extinction. So at this point in time, our horseshoe crabs are very close to modern sizes, but they're still kind of on the small size. Again, their shape is going to be similar to modern, and they're both living in both marine and freshwater environments. And so the one that's pictured here is Victolimulus mcqueeney. It's part of the Limulidae family. So again, that's that family of horseshoe crabs that we still have today. This one was found in Australia and we think was freshwater dwelling. And this fossil is really cool because we're seeing both the top side and the underside of that horseshoe crab. So we can see the top of its shell, all of its legs really, really clearly. And this, again, this is more evidence that our horseshoe crabs are really looking similar to the ones we see today. Another cool fossil that's coming out of the Cretaceous period was from the horseshoe crab Tachypleus syriacus. Again, is in the Limulidae family. But what's cool about this is that its excrement was fossilized both inside and outside of the body. And so in A, we're seeing like an overview of the horseshoe crab. And then in B, like on the top part, that's when that like gut content is still inside the body. And then under that, we're seeing some little kind of like rocky, shelly bits, and that's actually outside of the body. And so to us, this looks like our horseshoe crab was eating some things with shells. Someone is not seeing our fossil images. They should be next to the text on the slide.
Shireen, you have to change your view so that you are seeing speaker view instead of like gallery.
Um, but yeah, so usually our soft things, like, you know, what we eat, are not getting fossilized, but they were in this case. And so we see some shells and maybe some also mud that our horseshoe crab was eating, which would suggest that they were bottom feeding, which is what our horseshoe crabs do to this day. So that's really cool. We've also got India a picture of modern horseshoe crab excrement, you know, today, if in case you're curious. And I mentioned there was an extinction at the end of the Cretaceous. Only one lineage is going to survive, and that's the Limulidae family, and that's why that's the family of horseshoe crabs that we see today. And so now we're going to lump in kind of these more modern periods together. So we've got the Paleogene and the Neogene and the Quaternary period going from 66 million years ago to the present. And so now our Earth should be looking a little more familiar to everybody. These periods are known as the Age of Mammals. So we've got both marine and land mammals, including humans. In case you're curious, our hominids evolved around 2.6 million years ago, which is why the Quaternary period starts then. And we're seeing our species popping up between 200,000 and 300,000 years ago. We're seeing a gradual decrease in temperature of our Earth. It's closer to what we have today. We're seeing climatic zones develop, and also shifting of land masses is going to help with evolution, mostly for our animals on land. And then, of course, the Delaware Bay, which I mentioned is really important for my work at the Nature Center and for horseshoe crabs, is going to start filling in around 15,000 years ago. So it's really, really recent in this grand scheme of things. If you're curious, we have one fossil from these periods, and it was assigned to the genus Tachypleus, which is the horseshoe crabs that we see in Asia. So we jumped through many, many, many million years of horseshoe crab evolution. So I've got just a little timeline to wrap up kind of the key points for you. In the Cambrian period, we're seeing arthropods evolve. In the Ordovician is where our oldest horseshoe crab fossil is from. We see peak horseshoe crab diversity in the Carboniferous. The dinosaurs are going to rise and fall through the Triassic, Jurassic, and Cretaceous, but our horseshoe crabs will survive. And then up to the present day, horseshoe crabs persist. And so I've got these pictures and I've got this question again, has anything changed? And hopefully now you're giving this a more emphatic yes. And so my question then for you all is, we know things have changed, so why are horseshoe crabs still called living fossils? So here's some animals that are also called living fossils. Usually I make people like shout these out, but I won't force you all to. If you recognize any of these, we've got a coelacanth, we've got a goblin shark, we've got a nautilus, a crocodile, a ginkgo tree, and an aardvark. Yeah,
I
someone said
knew the
ginkgo.
coelacanth and the ginkgo. I was going
Awesome.
to yell them out, but you saved the
Yeah.
joke.
Awesome. So yeah, these are also animals that are called living fossils. And this term living fossils is something that was actually said by Charles Darwin, but really in passing. And so in his On the Origin of Species, which is kind of that like big fundamental text when we're thinking about natural selection and evolution, he only said the phrase living fossils twice. And so I've quoted one of those instances here where he said living fossils are species and groups of species which are called aberrant or just weird and which may fancifully be called living fossils. And so this is something that he just kind of wrote and then went on his way. But still, this is something that people bring up all the time. And so if you Google horseshoe crab, you're not going to find an article. You're be pretty difficult to find an article that doesn't call them living fossils. And so why are we still calling them this? What is a living fossil even? Who really knows? Some people have tried to define what a living fossil is. And so we've got some really interesting research where they came up with these criteria for what a living fossil is. And we see our horseshoe crab got 3 out of 5 for this criteria. Things like looking the same, so ancestral morphology, stasis over geologic time, resemblance to ancient fossil forms, restricted distribution, low taxonomic diversity. So these things kind of make sense to us, but we've looked at our fossil forms of horseshoe crabs. They haven't always looked the same. You know, we've got our Triassic horseshoe crabs with our really long genal spines, and we've got Vader limulus. And so looking at this, I would personally give them maybe like 2.5 out of 5 horseshoe crabs on this scale, but it's really up to you if you want to continue calling them living fossils. But I'm going to try to make an argument for why they're not. Getting into more kind of modern now ideas of our horseshoe crabs, we've got the first descriptions. And so the first horseshoe crab was actually described by Carl Linnaeus, who's the guy that came up with binomial nomenclature, which is where we give organisms a two-part scientific name in Latin. And then later in the 1700s and early 1800s is where our other species of horseshoe crabs were described. They've all got different names now. Throughout time, horseshoe crabs have also been called horsefoot crabs, saucepan crabs, helmet crabs, and king crabs. But we settled on horseshoe crabs, even though they're not really a crab. And it's been since 1881, we've known they're not really a crustacean. But the name horseshoe crab kind of just stuck. So if they're not a crab, what are they? We're going to get into a little bit of phylogeny. And so to like think about this simply, we've got our arthropods on the pink side, we've got our arthropods with jaws, and then on the blue side, we've got our arthropods with fangs or pincers, also known as chelicerae. And so our horseshoe crab chelicerae, or this is the picture in the bottom right corner that I've circled in blue. It's these like two little guys that they use to help put food into their mouth. And so we see our horseshoe crabs over in blue with our sea spiders and our arachnids, like our spiders, our scorpions, and our mites. And then on our other side, we've got our crabs would fall into crustacea, which is in that pink with our trilobites. They're coming back for us. And some people will actually place horseshoe crabs within the arachnids. And it's pretty much argued that they're not, but you know, it's really up to you depending on what kind of test you run, how you want to place them. But what's important to know is that our horseshoe crabs are in the subphylum Chelicerata because they have chelicerae, and they're more closely related to spiders, scorpions, and mites than they are to actual crabs. Leads us to our 4 living species. And so Limulus polyphemus is the Atlantic or the American horseshoe crab, and that's the species of horseshoe crab that we have near us. They live up and down the coast of North America and also into the Gulf of Mexico. Their name, Limulus polyphemus, Limulus is that blanked cyclops from Greek mythology that has one eye. And then polyphemus means odd or askew. And so this is kind of like the weird one-eyed horseshoe crab. I also wanted to mention when Linnaeus first described the horseshoe crab, he called it monoculus polyphemus, which just means like one-eyed monster. And so he was talking about like this like dot in the front of the horseshoe crab that we see that he thought was like their one eye. We'll talk about in a minute that horseshoe crabs have way more than one eye. But anyway, someone was really fixated on this one-eyed thing of the horseshoe crab, and that's what stuck. We also have Carcinoscorpius rotundicata, which is the mangrove horseshoe crab. And so Carcinoscorpius means crab scorpion, which makes sense. And rotundicata means round tail. And if you're looking at that tail, and maybe may not look very round to you, that actually refers to like the circumference of it. Our regular horseshoe crabs are kind of more triangular, where theirs is more circular or round tail. Also got Tachypleus tridentatus, or the tri-spine horseshoe crab, and that's referring to like the 3 spines that we see like from these eyes, and on the front those are the 3 spines, the Chinese horseshoe crab. And as well, we have Tachypleus gigas, which is giant. I've scoured the internet, and for the life of me, I have no idea what Tachypleus means. I'm not sure why they are named that. I wish I did, but that's the species of horseshoe crabs that we have, and this is where they live. And so we've got some colored lines. The green line is where Limnaeus polyphemus is. Then we've got some like orange and blue and yellow lines over in Asia. And we also have mapped here where all the fossils of horseshoe crabs have been found, which is pretty cool. They used to be way more global than they are now, and now they're just restricted to these couple of locations. So we talked about kind of living fossils, and so now we're thinking about modern wonders. And so horseshoe crabs have been around for hundreds of millions of years, but I kind of want to challenge you to think about horseshoe crabs as an animal with an ancient appearance and a modern lifestyle. And so maybe they're not quite as modern as my little picture here, but they're living in the same world that you and I are living in, that other animals are living in. And something that I was taught in school is to kind of push aside this notion of like more or less evolved and think about everything that's living at the same time as the same kind of like level of evolved. And so the horseshoe crabs aren't just here by chance. They didn't happen to live for millions and millions of years. There's a reason why, and they're living in our world today. And I think they're pretty modern and pretty wonderful. And so the things or the aspects of their modern life that we're going to talk about are their genetic diversity, their advanced eyesight, their relationship with shorebirds, and their relationship with people. And so, first, in terms of genetic diversity, I really want to drive home this point that changes in DNA can, but do not always equal changes in appearance. And so, our horseshoe crabs may have looked the same for millions of years, but that doesn't mean that they haven't been changing on the genetic level. And in fact, throughout their time on Earth, they've undergone 2 or 3 whole genome duplication events. So what that is, it's like your whole genome. So if like you took all of your DNA and stretched it out, has doubled twice. So they actually have more genetic material to work with and more chance to evolve. The most recent duplication event was in the Jurassic period, which is kind of also when we're seeing like that like sameness of horseshoe crabs today. So that kind of makes sense. They've been working with the same genetic material since that point in time. In terms of the genetic diversity of our horseshoe crabs, it really varies both within and among populations. And so, Tachypleus, which is one of those Asian horseshoe crab species, in a study across several habitats, was found to be pretty diverse. In contrast, Carcinoscorpius rotundicata was found to be losing some diversity. Closer to home in South Carolina, their population of horseshoe crabs was found to be large, diverse, and healthy, was what was published. And in the Delaware Bay, there's a really good ratio of male to female horseshoe crabs. I think it's estimated to be about 4 to 1 right now. So we've got lots of eligible bachelors out there ready to start some nice genetically diverse horseshoe crab families. Another thing that's really modern and cool about our horseshoe crabs is their eyes. And so horseshoe crabs actually have 10 eyes, but 2 of those eyes that are really special are their lateral or on the side of their head compound eyes. And they're called compound eyes because they're made up of a bunch of little lenses. And that's what's in the picture we see here. And those lenses are actually huge. We can see them. This was just taken like with a regular camera. We can see those lenses of the horseshoe crab with our naked eye. And so back in the day, we thought it would be a really good idea to use them as a model for study. And so that's what H.K. Hartline did. And his work with horseshoe crabs has been really, really monumental in understanding how we go from seeing something to actually like seeing something. So, like how our eyes provide vision, not just like sensory input. He won a Nobel Prize for his work in 1967, but a lot of that research has continued. What we've learned is that our horseshoe crab's eyes are very sensitive to changes in light. They can also see in multiple directions, and we think up to about 5 feet. And they're able to adapt to day and night really well, which is important so they know when they want to go up on the beaches to mate and to lay their eggs. Horseshoe crabs and shorebirds are also really important. Again, I mentioned 2 things people come to the DuPont Nature Center to see are our horseshoe crabs and shorebirds. That's because our shorebirds have a really strong dependency on our horseshoe crabs. So the shorebirds that are migrating, especially the red knot, is one of the more popular ones. Have a really long way to fly and they need energy for that flight. And they're stopping in the Delaware Bay because there's tons of horseshoe crabs laying tons of horseshoe crab eggs. And so when they stop here, those horseshoe crab eggs are the main food source for many birds, but especially the red knot, which have actually timed their migration to make sure they're coming to the Delaware Bay when there's the most horseshoe crab eggs on the beaches. And so this is a very modern phenomenon. We did not have birds until, pretty late on. So our birds have not always been eating horseshoe crab eggs. So this is another reason our horseshoe crabs are really built for this world. Something else that's One of the more well-known things about horseshoe crabs is their blood and the biomedical industry. And so I won't make you all like raise your hands or shout out or anything, but if you just want to think in your mind as I go through this list, if any of these things apply to you. So I've been to a hospital, I've been to a medical clinic, received an injection, taken a prescription drug, if you wear contact lenses, if you've had some form of surgery, if you've had stitches for a wound, if you've had part of your body, like a knee, a heart, or a hip replaced, or if you've received some form of vaccine, you can say thank you to a horseshoe crab. So horseshoe crabs have this really special blue blood. It's blue because it has hemocyanin in it, and that's that like oxygen carrying component of the blood, whereas we have hemoglobin. So hemoglobin is iron based, which is why our blood is red. Hemocyanin is copper based, which is why their blood is blue. That blood is actually diffuse throughout their body, so they don't really have veins and arteries the way that we do. Their blood is just kind of floating around in all of their open spaces. And it's really good at coagulating. So if they get injured, if a horseshoe crab were to get injured, that blood would clot up. And so we really rarely see horseshoe crabs that have bled out kind of in the wild. But the most important thing about that blood is that it's really good at detecting toxins or bacteria. And so, if any type of endotoxin gets into that horseshoe crab's bloodstream, the blood is able to clot around it and eradicate it. And so, we also very rarely see horseshoe crabs that get sick in the wild. When we learned that horseshoe crab blood could do this for them, of course, we also thought, could horseshoe crab blood do this for us? And so there's a test called LAL, Limulus amoebocyte lysate, that's been developed that's derived from horseshoe crab blood. And so Limulus is that genus name. Amoebocyte is the type of blood cell that's in the horseshoe crab that does this clotting. And then lysate is like lysis, like breaking the cells apart. That's how the test was developed. Um, and so this test is used on all of our vaccines, our medical equipment, our contact lenses, our prosthetics, everything that's relevant to that list I mentioned before. And it's something that we really appreciate the horseshoe crabs for, but it's also something that's really been kind of a detriment to them. And so a lot of people, especially recently, have been asking about synthetic versions or alternate versions to this LAL test. And so far, nothing has proven itself to be like as um, reliable or as specific, but there is a test called recombinant factor C, which is like a synthetic version of LAL that is kind of in the works at the moment to replace LAL so that we don't need to bleed horseshoe crabs. So now we're kind of thinking about the fate of our horseshoe crabs. And so we've seen fluctuations in our horseshoe crab populations throughout their history as we've used them for different things. One is as fertilizer. And so horseshoe crabs, especially in this area, which is a very agricultural economy, horseshoe crabs were used as a really popular fertilizer. And so that use stopped by the 1980s. But at that point, they started to become more popular for use as bait for people who are fishing for both eel and for whelk. And that's something that's still happening to this day. It's very regulated. Depending on which state you're in, there's different regulations on how many horseshoe crabs you can harvest. In Delaware, it's currently capped at 500,000 males. And then, of course, we have our biomedical use of our horseshoe crabs. And we're now kind of, many would argue, we're in the midst of a sixth great extinction. So we talked about 5 of them, but now we're in a sixth. And this one isn't the result of a meteor or a volcano or some other natural climate cycle, but is a change in climate that's human caused. And so includes things like habitat destruction, general ecosystem disruption, and we're kind of working with the potential that we lose a lot of species and an impact on all of our life on Earth, including our horseshoe crabs. And so now I have kind of this question for you all: if horseshoe crabs will continue to be a wonder to us, or if they'll become just another fossil. That is all I have for right now. Here's my contact information and also the information for the Nature Center. And I'm sure people have questions, so I would love to take some questions now. See some in the chat if we want to start with those.
One of the
Sorry for ending
questions.
on sorry for ending on a sad note. Didn't mean to do that.
We all were going to ask that though, like how are the crabs doing now?
Yeah.
One of the questions says, do the other 3 species of horseshoe crabs also have the blue blood, and are they used for medical purposes like the Atlantic ones?
Yeah, so they all have that same blue blood. And one of the Asian species, it's one of the ones that's in the genus Tachypleus. I believe I want to say it's it might also honestly be both of the Tachypleus genus horseshoe crabs are used for medical purposes, just like the Atlantic ones. And so we have LAL, so Limulus amoebocyte lysate. They have TAL, which is Tachypleus amoebocyte lysate. So they are used for medical purposes. But we just have so many more horseshoe crabs than they do. Our population here is huge. So yeah.
I see what you mean about how hard it is to find out that word. So tachy means fast, like
Okay.
tachycardia, but I couldn't find Plius anywhere. I don't know. I think they
Yeah.
mixed Greek and French somehow, but it's if there's something fast, fast.
Hmm.
Anyway, more
That's
questions are coming in.
interesting because if you've ever seen a horseshoe crab, they're not really that
Right,
fast.
maybe
That's
it's
okay.
relative. They're slightly faster than the others, but who knows? One person wants to know, is their defense mechanism simply the shell?
Yeah, so they have this kind of like helmet shaped shell like we wear when we're like riding our bikes, for example. A lot of people will ask if this tail is a defense mechanism. Not really. They do have like they're a little spiny, and when they're younger, we see on their molts they have like a few more like spikes, so that helps. But for the most part, they're just kind of like hunkering down on the seafloor, and that's their defense mechanism. Their greatest predator is humans. After that, sometimes sharks and like loggerhead sea turtles will eat them. But for the most part, they're unbothered, just being their little dome-shaped self. Yeah.
All right, let's move down a few more questions here. How did we narrow down duplicating their DNA to the Jurassic?
That is a really interesting question that I actually do not know off the top of my head. Like I've read it at some point, but I'm not entirely sure. I know that first genome duplication we think happened at the same time, like before our horseshoe crabs kind of like split from the arachnids, like before they were horseshoe crabs, because arachnids also show that like genome duplication. But unfortunately, I do not know how we got the Jurassic off the top of my head. I can definitely like look into it, and if you want to like email me, I can email you back because I can find where I was reading about that. Yeah.
All right, so are
Yeah.
they protected, presumably?
They are protected. Yeah. So the harvest of horseshoe crabs, like I said, varies by state. Unfortunately, those harvest caps are only in place for horseshoe crabs that are harvested for bait use. So it's the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission is the one who places those caps. And so horseshoe crabs that are harvested for biomedical use are not as well regulated. We don't actually have the exact numbers on like how many horseshoe crabs they're collecting, how many are surviving. They have numbers that they publish, but we're not sure like how reliable those are. But for the most part, the horseshoe crab like populations are doing well right now, and a lot of that is because we regulated the harvest for the fisheries, because that's kind of like what would be a detriment to them. Because the horseshoe crabs that are collected for bleeding are not like most of them survive, and they're released. Of course, the horseshoe crabs that are collected for bait are used as bait, so those ones aren't coming back. So that was kind of the focus for where we needed the most regulations.
Some related questions then. Do we know
Yeah.
exactly how many horseshoe crabs are left in the world? And someone else wants to know what we can do to help them.
Ooh, in the world, I'm not sure. In the Delaware Bay, the current estimate is 40 million males, 16 million females. That is like hot off the presses from last year's beach surveys. That's the number they gave us. Um, Unfortunately, I do not know. I know it's way, way, way fewer of the Asian species.
Any reason why they're not on the West Coast?
Hmm. I believe, from what I understand, back in the day, people have tried to introduce the horseshoe crabs to the West Coast and it didn't work well. Like they didn't survive very long. I'm not really sure, I guess, because of like their, like historical distribution and like continental shifts and things like that. Like I know they're restricted on the Atlantic coast because of where like the continental shelf is, and then they're also a little bit temperature restricted. In my mind, I feel like they could survive on the West Coast, like in the Pacific, but they are not found there. And we now don't want to like introduce animals that are not found. We don't want to create an invasive species. So we haven't really tried to put them over there, but I'm not sure why they aren't like naturally there. The whole distribution of the horseshoe crab thing is really interesting to me, since we see with the fossils have been found around the world, and somehow we're only left with these horseshoe crabs like off the coast of North America and in Asia. It's really interesting. That's one of those other like mysteries of the horseshoe crab that we don't quite know. Yeah.
And there's a question about the different shapes. So, have there been any
Yes.
studies of the advantages and drawbacks of their shapes in travel, in moving
Hmm.
through sand or through mud or over sand or mud?
So I'm not sure. I'm not sure I understand the question. Sorry, actually, I can see it. Drawbacks of like if their shape is better for sand or mud. Is that kind of
Maybe,
what your
yeah.
question is? Yeah,
Is
so
that right, Gene?
they prefer kind of like coarse sand that's easy to move through, easy to push to like lay their eggs in. They can live in kind of muddier environments, like the mangrove horseshoe crab. In Asia, for example, does live in like mangroves, which are a bit muddier. Um, I mean, they're pretty much like okay to live wherever. They just tend to we find them on beaches mostly. I don't, as far as I know, there isn't like a connection between shell shape and their environment. Yeah.
All right, let's
Lots
see.
of
We got a few
questions.
more here. How many eggs do the crab produce?
Yeah,
A
so
lot,
each
right?
Yeah, each season, a female horseshoe crab can lay between 80,000 and 100,000 eggs, which is a ton. Unfortunately, only between 3 and 30, not 3 and 30,000, but just 3 and 30 of those will actually survive through their first year. But since we have so many horseshoe crabs, especially like in the Delaware Bay, for example, laying so many eggs, their population, maintains pretty well.
Other kind
I
of
also have
questions about how long do they live?
Yeah, horseshoe
Um,
crabs will live between 20 and 25 years.
cool. Okay. Have any studies been done to investigate if they feel pain?
Hmm. I cannot say for sure. Um, I from what I understand, a lot of arthropods can like sense but not feel the way we do. And so they can like react to stimulus in their environment. So like if something like touches them, they can like kind of like move away from that. But I don't think they feel pain in the way that we do necessarily.
Not sure how you would study that. That's interesting.
Yeah.
How are warmer ocean temperatures a
Mm.
specific problem for them?
Yeah. So horseshoe crabs are not, they're pretty resilient. And so like a little bit of a warmer ocean wouldn't be a real issue for them. The main issue is that when we have warmer oceans, they're gonna think it's, kind of like summer, for example, when it's still like winter or spring. That's a bit of an exaggeration, but they're like perceptions of seasons will be changed with different water temperatures. So they may be coming up onto the beaches sooner to lay their eggs, which doesn't really affect them, but it does affect the shorebirds who are migrating for those horseshoe crab eggs. The horseshoe crabs come up sooner or laying their eggs, shorebirds show up and miss the whole spawning situation. That's not very good for them. But the horseshoe crabs themselves are pretty resilient to different changing temperatures.
And then there was a question about the photo. How many
Mhm.
horseshoe crab species displayed in your fossil photos were from the German limestone quarry?
Of my pictures are just like in that slide. Um, a really good question. I have actually, I can just show you this. Um, this last source on here, the Pictorial Atlas of Fossil and Extant Horseshoe Crabs, is where I got most of my fossil pictures from. It's a really great paper. It gets like super into like taxonomic details, so it can be like a bit tricky to read through even for like me who like likes taxonomy. But they've got really great pictures through all of the different periods. And they would be able to give you in that paper would be able to give you like an exact answer. They'd have like the figure caption on there of how many species were in that photo. And this article is like publicly available. You don't have to pay for it or anything.
Awesome, helpful.
Yeah.
Let's see. Here's this question is interesting. What do they feel like to the touch? Are there sharp edges?
Oh, okay. Yeah. So they're pretty smooth. The one on my picture is this like plastic model horseshoe crab that I've been showing. They have these like this one is plastic, so it's a bit different. These in real life are like flexible, so like this will not poke you. Um, Over like here, these genospines can be like a little bit sharper, but they're not sharp. The tip of their tail is like a little bit pokey, but doesn't like hurt. Yeah, I encourage you to get out to Slaughter Beach between May and June and pick up some horseshoe crabs with care because it's a really cool experience.
So how do they use their tails?
Yeah, so their tail is primarily used to help them flip over. So if they're it mostly works better underwater. If they get stuck on their back, they can use this tail as like a little kickstand and help them like flip over. A lot of times we see them on the beach and they are unable to flip over because it doesn't always work. It works better in water, but the primary function of the tail is to help them flip over when they get stuck on their back. Yeah.
What is the largest horseshoe crab ever found?
Ooh, hold on. I'm gonna grab something for you.
So Daisy, I see your question about the trip on the 24th. Reagan and I talked about this early, and apparently they are closed for Memorial
Okay.
Day at that time,
This
unfortunately.
may not be the largest ever found, but this is a shell that was brought to us. It is massive. This is the largest horseshoe crab that I've ever seen. Usually this one we would call like a big one, and it's like way smaller. So this is the largest horseshoe crab I've ever seen. But yeah, I
That
would
is
imagine they
impressive.
don't get much larger than that.
If you're at the beach and these horseshoe crabs are around, is it okay to handle them? Can we pick them up and flip them
Yep.
over?
Yep. So definitely, if a horseshoe crab is stuck on its back, it's helpful for them to flip them over. So they have their gills are down here. We have lungs. They have book gills, and they can live out of land for a little bit as long as their gills stay wet. And so what happens to a lot of our horseshoe crabs is they get stuck on their back. Their gills dry out. Is what happens to them. So if you just want to flip them over, the best way to hold them is just by the sides of their shell and give them like a gentle rotation. Really important to not pick them up by their tail. It looks like it'd be a helpful handle, but this is connected by like a really flimsy piece of muscle. And if you hurt their tail, then you reduce their chance of being able to like use their tail to help them flip over. They get stuck on their back. So yeah, it's horseshoe crabs are totally safe to handle. They don't bite, they don't sting, they don't pinch. But just make sure you're of course being careful with them. They're a living animal. We want to treat them with respect and holding them by the sides of their shell to flip them over.
Couple other questions here.
Yeah.
So after they die, what eats the shells?
Yeah. So a lot of times, so immediately after they die, we'll see a lot of birds, especially seagulls, will go for those gills. And then the shells kind of just like hang out on the beach, especially around here. If you go to like Slaughter Beach or any of the Delaware Bay beaches, the shells kind of stay there for a bit. And so nothing is really eating the shells. But those shells will kind of break down eventually, and that like organic material will get recycled into the environment. Sometimes like other crabs, things that scavenge will eat kind of like what's left over. Horseshoe crabs are not very meaty. But yeah, nothing is specifically going after their shells, but their shells will kind of break down and become part of like the organic material that animals are going to eat out of the sand or the water, for example.
So you mentioned, I think the shells are made of chitin. What else in
Yes.
nature would be made of that material for a reference?
Trying to think. I So like it's pretty similar to like the shell of like a blue crab or I'm trying to think of something else. Like a lobster, like our crustaceans, they have very similar like shell kind of composition.
That helps.
Yeah.
Another question, how can you tell the individual's age?
Mm. Most of that is going to be based on size. There is like a formula somewhere that's comparing like, oh, if the shell diameter is like this much, we think it's this old. For the most part, though, if we're seeing them come onto the beaches, that means they're ready to mate, they're ready to spawn, which means they're sexually mature, and that happens between 8 and 10 years old. So most of the ones we're seeing on the beach are at least 8 or 10, and then the females are going to be larger than the males, but the larger horseshoe crabs generally are older. I can again, if you want to email me, I can get you that like exact thing for how to calculate how old they are, but it is more or less just their size.
So I'll share your email with everybody in the group
Yeah, I
tonight
can put
so they
that
can
back
do that.
on the
And is
screen.
is there also a way to get like current information about what's a good time to visit the beach before you drive out there?
Yeah, so generally the horseshoe crabs are not as like the horseshoe crabs coming onto the beaches is not as like time limited as like the shorebirds migrating. And so we're already starting to see like a couple horseshoe crabs come up, but peak is in May and June, and then they'll kind of hang out through July, even August a little bit. But really anytime in May and June is a good bet. If you're interested in seeing the horseshoe crabs spawning, nighttime, full moon, new moon, high tide. Those are your requirements you want to meet because they're coming up onto the beaches at night to spawn when that high tide can bring them really far up onto the beach so they can lay their eggs away from other predators or away from ocean predators at least. And the full moon and the new moon are when they're liking to come up onto the beaches. So if you want to check the tide chart, check the moon, that'll help you out.
It is 8 o'clock, so we should probably wrap this up.
Yep.
One more question though: do adults burrow like the young? Mike had
Mm.
horseshoe crabs in a large aquarium in his classroom, and they were rarely visible for the kids to see.
Yeah, so they don't burrow as much. Generally, they're kind of crawling along looking for food. The young ones tend to burrow because they're not as like strong and sturdy. So they will burrow to keep themselves safe. Generally is why we see the young ones burrowing. The adults don't tend to burrow. Um, yeah.
And I think Rachel's pointing out that I think insect exoskeletons are also made of chitin.
Yes. Yeah. The horseshoe crabs is just like a if you think about like an insect exoskeleton, you can like crush it really easily. The horseshoe crab exoskeleton isn't as fragile. It's like a tinge sturdier than that. But yeah, very similar.
Awesome. Thank you. Just kudos and appreciation coming in
Yeah,
now on the
thanks so
chat.
much.
Thank you so much for your time, Reagan. That was fantastic.
Thank you. Yeah, and then like I said, if anyone else has any other questions, feel free to email me or stop by the Nature Center, call the Nature Center. I'm not just saying this because I work there. I do really think the Nature Center is an awesome place to visit. Slaughter Beach is awesome if you're interested in horseshoe crabs. But yeah, thank you all so much for coming. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.